Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. I'm continuing with my discussions on the Odyssey, and now I'm going to be discussing Odysseus's journey into the underworld. Excuse me, the underworld. So, Odysseus had been ensconced with his men in the palace of Circe, the goddess, or sorceress. Now, he had decided to stay with her and be her lover for about a year. Of course, he'd been given an antidote, herbal antidote, a Mali, to insulate him against her magic. And eventually, he agreed to sleep with her so that she would turn his men that she'd converted into swine back to humans again. And this happened. But after all of that, he decided to stay with her and be her lover for a year. It was his men that eventually urged him that they needed to move on and return to Ithaca. Now, I did an earlier video just addressing what many feminists think about how Homer treats women, that he seems to treat women as a in a negative way, as very lecherous. They just desire to use men as they're just trying to use Odysseus constantly as a sex object, or to satisfy their amorous desires, or in a maternalistic fashion. But really, he does show some balance. I don't think he necessarily portrays women or feminine characters, the feminine gods, in a negative way. And we see it even with Circe. Circe was one of the most terrible uh, females in the Odyssey, but we see after she becomes his lover for a year, and when he wants to go, she shows her goodwill, right? So she lets him go, but she just doesn't let him leave on his own. But she wants to make sure that he's successful, that he can break the curse, and so she advises him. Circe advises Odysseus to go into the underworld and seek the counsel of a blind prophet named Tiresias, right? So she tells him to go and make a sacrifice to Tiresias in the underworld, and he'd be able to, give give Odysseus advice on how to safely get home. So Odysseus does this. He makes a sacrifice and he goes to see this blind prophet in the underworld. Now, while in the underworld, he sees his mother, right? He sees, it's like a Greek it's an underworld in the place, the afterlife for in Greek mythology. And there he sees his mother's dead. He sees the ghosts of his mother, of the Trojan heroes, the heroes in the Trojan War, Achilles, and Agamemnon, and so on and so forth. But importantly, he meets the blind prophet Tiresias, and Tiresias gives him advice, on how to break the curse, what he needed to do to get safely home. So Tiresias tells him that, well, when he gets to the island of Thrinacia, right, that he's going to encounter some sacred cattle that belonged to the sun god Helios, and he warned Odysseus that neither he nor his men were to harm the cattle. They went to eat the cattle, or all his men would die. He'd lose all his crew. His ship will be wrecked, and he'll be the only one who gets home after a very a long, more perilous journey, right? So he warned Odysseus not to harm the cattle, the sacred cattle that belonged to the sun god Helios on the island of Thrinacia. Additionally, he lets Odysseus know that Poseidon was angry with him, and that was why he was going through all the hardships, the perils at sea, and it would continue unless Odysseus would make sacrifices to appease Poseidon. And so he tells him that when Odysseus gets home, that he's going to find um, Penelope's suitors who were eating him out of house and home, basically wasting his wealth, that is, his wealth. And so he instructs Odysseus that he must slaughter all the suitors. So you see in the book later on, right, that Odysseus does slaughter all the suitors and even his, the maids that had been disloyal, who had become lovers to the suitors in a very brutal way. Odysseus is instructed additionally that after slaughtering the suitors, he was to travel inland, right, to a it was to get an oar, right, get an oar and travel inland to journey until he reaches a place where there's a people who know nothing about the sea. They know nothing about seafaring, right, and they don't salt their food. And he was supposed to hang around there until a traveler encounters him and mistakes uh, his oar for a winnowing fan, right? So this is the instruction. And when that happens, he's supposed to bury the oar and make a grand sacrifice to Poseidon, right? He's supposed to make a grand sacrifice to Poseidon to appease him so he can live to a peaceful old age and die in peace, right? And and not die a violent death, so he could finally appease Poseidon. He also tells him that Odysseus was to return home after that grand sacrifice to Odysseus, because he's supposed to, make that grand sacrifice after burying the oar in the exact place where a traveler mistakes his oar for a winnowing fan. And so Odysseus is supposed to return home, and when he returns home, he's supposed to make another sacrifice, additional sacrifice to the deathless gods, the other immortal gods, and then Poseidon would finally be appeased, and he would be able to live to a good old age. And from Greek mythology, Greek legends, Odysseus did live to be an old man, lived and died peacefully at around 70 years old, right? Uh, and so that was very good advice from Circe, who had been his lover for a year and who had originally sought to harm him. So we see that Homer does treat the women with balance. They're a central force, right, in Iliad and uh, the the Odyssey. It depends on interpretation, right? They are very significant. Clearly, they have roles, gender roles. Of course, this was over 2,000 years ago. It is kind of ironic, though, or interesting that um, the when we consider gender roles, because this was demonstrated when Telemachus tells his mother off, basically silences her when she comes down, when there's a bard singing about the Trojan War, and Penelope, the mother of Telemachus, uh, comes down and asks him to stop playing the bard about the Trojan War, and her son Telemachus sort of silences her, shuts her up, and tells her to return to a woman's task, to go back into her room and and continue her weaving, right? So you see some kind of assigned gender roles, and to leave them, for the men in the hall to go about their business, right? That there's things that have to do with policy, statecraft, business. That was those were duties assigned to men, right? More masculine roles, and women went to get involved. And women were supposed to be doing some kind of domesticated work like weaving. But ironically, um, in Greek mythology, and we see in this, in the tale of the Odyssey, the god of war and wisdom is actually a woman, Athena, who was the patron of Odysseus, right? Who gives him protection and ultimate victory. And she's the one who appeals to Zeus to free um, Odysseus from the curse of Poseidon and let him finally return home. In any event, I hope this was helpful. I was able to keep it under 10 minutes thereabout, and I'll continue with my discussions on the Odyssey. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.